G'day and welcome back to Reality Check. I'm your host, Ross Coulthart, and today I've got a very interesting story about a new two-part documentary, The Alien Perspective, made by filmmaker Dean Aliotto, and he's joined today by an old friend of mine, Sean Cahill, who's the former Master-at-Arms on the USS Princeton, one of the witnesses to the extraordinary 2004 USS Nimitz battle fleet incident of UFOs, raining UFOs, as my friend Kevin Day has described. Welcome to Reality Check, gentlemen. Lovely to have you here.
Great to be here.
Good to see you.
So, Dean, tell me first, what's the idea behind the Alien Perspective? What are you trying to achieve with this film? I understand it's on Apple TV in 2 parts. Tell me all about it.
And Amazon. So the idea came about because I had made this film many years ago, 37 years ago, right out of film school, called The McPherson Tape, which was the first found footage film. And it was about a family being abducted because I'd read the book Communion, scared the crap out of me more than any Stephen King novel. And so I made...
Can I stop you there? Because I'm so pleased you started with the McPherson Tape, because I know your work on the McPherson Tape and I rewatched it last night and it's still scary. But what really blew me away about that film was you managed to, I mean, it was kind of, for me, whilst I enjoyed the fact that it was such an incredibly persuasive film, that it was authentic footage. It was kind of like Blair Witch Project. What really kind of upset me a little bit was that people were fooled. Like Tom Dongo, one of the old eminent screes of UFO researchers, was fooled. And I think I've forgotten his name. There was a Lieutenant
Colonel Don Ware.
Yeah. I felt very sad that they were essentially tricked. Tell me, though, the context. What was the fallout from the McPherson film?
Sure. So I made this film, and because it was 10 years before the Blair Witch, it was looked upon as being this weird kind of avant-garde piece of crap, to be honest, because you've got people talking over each other. You have long takes, very much the tropes now today in found footage. Well, I made this thing, and then it got distributed miraculously. But then a month later, the distribution company, I called them to say, hey, how is the movie doing? How's it selling? And he goes, oh, it's up in flames. And I went, yes, that's great. How many units do we sell? VHS. And he says, no, mate, it's gone, as in up in flames. Our warehouse burned to the ground. So your master, gone. Your artwork, gone. And so I thought, well, that's the film god saying, nice try, kid, move on. And so I did. And then 5 years later, I get a call from some guy that just came from the International UFO Congress Convention, where the film screened without any credits. And so we reverse engineered this and discovered that someone had edited off the credits and injected it to the UFO community, because a few mom and pop video stores, which they used to have back then, got an advanced screener. And so it ended up at this International UFO Congress Convention, and it brought the house down. So this guy called to say Unsolved Mysteries, hard copy, and a Fox show called Encounters want to do a segment on this. And I said, well, I guess Unsolved Mysteries is out. And this guy I know that's a whole other story. He said, well, not necessarily. And I said, yeah, it's called Unsolved, not Solved Mysteries. So we'll go on this Fox show. And we did this thing. And so I think I guess I'm the first filmmaker to ever debunk my own film because of that very reason, Ross, which is I didn't want to have this on the plate of serious UFO researchers. So I did everything I could. I posted pictures when the internet hit of behind the scenes, everything, and just said, look, this is an example of what might happen if this goes down, but this is not the real thing. And I brought actors out from the film, everything.
It's funny, because I was really thinking about how to come into this interview today, because I was actually going to raise the McPherson film because I was really confronted by it. I rewatched it last night, and I watched the episode you're talking about on the TV show. And it's interesting because at the heart of the issue for ufology at the moment, there is a dilemma. There's too much emphasis, I think, being placed on, frankly, bullshit vision, crap video that people send me. I get hundreds of videos a day. People haven't done any checks, any prosaic checks to see whether or not the video might be explainable away prosaically. And it's a big issue because with AI these days, it's just so easy to fake, to forge genuine looking, authentic looking UFO vision. What do we do about that? Isn't that a big dilemma for the whole subject matter?
Well, I go online and I kind of am that debunker in the sense of if it's bunk, I'm going to underscore it and do that because I have a little bit of savviness doing special effects on films where I can see where like the frame rate is off or whatever, but it's proliferated to the point where it's just this onslaught bombardment. And so my feeling is that I thought, which was the reason why I actually made the first documentary, The Alien Perspective Part 1, was I got invited for the 25th anniversary to go back to the International UFO Congress Convention and to present, they have like these 75-minute TED Talks essentially. And I said, at first I go, I'm not interested in that because I don't know how I'm going to be received because I take my work very serious, but I don't take myself serious. And I feel like kind of the Forrest Gump in all this. And he said, no, they're great. Tons of levity. Don't worry about it. And I came and fell in love with the community. That was 2018. So I've always been kind of an armchair prosumer. And then I became an armchair expert because I've done documentaries for A&E, Bravo, et cetera. I thought, boy, there's a real opportunity here to tap into the UFO community and serious experiencers as well as accredited people from Oxford and get Michio Kaku. Because I've done science docs, I can pull these people in and have them talk, even as a hypothetical, about this. And so the one thing that I knew that I had to do, because we've seen so many UFO docs, Ross, you've seen tons, is to present it in a way that hasn't been done before. And what I do as a filmmaker is I look and see what everyone's doing, then I do the opposite. In this case, all of the UFO docs, out of necessity, are all told from the human's perspective. I consulted on James Fox's The Phenomenon and believe in that. However, I thought, what if you did this as a hypothetical? What could be gleaned from this, looking at it from the alien's perspective? So that was the thesis, and that sent me off on a 7-year journey, 66 interviews, and 4 countries later. It's time to get it out there, and it's pretty wild because I'm serving two masters. One is the UFO community who know everything, and then the other is to get people who are kind of bi UFO curious and come on board and say, we're going to start at NASA. We'll go easy, but then we're going to go hardcore. And that spans over 2 films. The first one is out. The second one drops June 1st.
Now, one of the incidents, of course, that you talk about is the USS Nimitz battle fleet incident that took place in 2004, which, of course, is one of the definitive UFO UAP incidents where, for the first time, you had multiple sensor systems, multiple grade A human eyeballs on these objects, giving definitive witness statements, credible statements, and more importantly, you had phased array radar systems. And one of those eyeballs was you, Sean. I think you were standing on the bridge of the USS Princeton as Kevin Day was calling in what they were seeing on the screens. Can you talk me through that?
That's correct. Over the course of a week, back in 2004, I was stationed on board the USS Princeton as the Chief Master at Arms. Kevin was calling me up on the bridge, and we were coordinating ship movements to aid him in focusing the radar, pointing it in certain directions, and keeping the watch officer's eyes on the skies for anomalies as he was detecting them on the radar. It was an incredible week, and it frankly, in my opinion, it's the case that Arrow and others should be focusing on, absolutely laser focused on. We have the most information on it, and we've probably heard the least about it from authority.
So, what did you see?
Well, over the course of that week, I didn't see any radar contacts. I was responding to Kevin's calls on the telephone, but at one point he had called up and very vehemently reiterated that he needed me to make sure all of my watchstanders were scanning the skies for anomalous contacts. And so I went out and I'd walked around the deck and spoke personally to each of them, and then went back up onto the port side bridge wing of the ship, where I began scanning with my own binoculars. I was there with another sailor who was utilizing what we call the big eyes, which are really just a very, very large pair of stationary binoculars on the bridge. Both of us were scanning off the port side, and as I scanned from the port beam up to the to the forecastle, I saw 5 to 7 lights up in the sky, up in this constellation. And they started immediately, one by one, moving centrally towards the center and then blinking out. And I'd never seen anything like that at all. I'd spent years training people in use of flares, different weapon systems. I'd been exposed to all the different weapon systems we have, whether they're defensive or offensive. And I knew what I was looking at in the battle space. And I had never seen anything that closely packed maneuvering like that before. They were just white lights, but 5 or 7 of them. And as I say, I'm not exactly sure how many because they were moving, but each of them singularly, one at a time, circled into the center of this formation and then disappeared. I'd never seen anything like that. The following day, in the morning, when I woke up from after the watch, we had the videos sent over from the USS Nimitz, and it was the most incredible thing I'd ever seen. All of us were familiar with what FLIR pods and what infrared and night vision looks like, and all of the nomenclature on the screen, and we knew that we were looking at something that was not in our arsenal. It had no wings, it had no propulsion systems, it was not giving off a proper heat signature like a normal aircraft, and it maneuvered in a way on the video like we'd never seen before. And as we all know now, the corroborating evidence from the pilots and what they saw says that what we were dealing with that day were not human-derived aircraft.
So put me into Dean's brain on that subject. What's the alien perspective on the Nimitz incident that we haven't got to date?
Me or Sean?
I'm Sean or you. I'm really open to. I'm really open to both of you.
Why don't you take this, Sean?
When I met Dean back in, I believe, 2018, he was one of the first people that I met in the UFO community. I was introduced to him by Luis Elizondo at Comic-Con here in San Diego. We'd met up and did a little thing for, I believe, Den of Geek to promote some other stuff. I believe the show Unidentified that I was appearing on with Luis. And in that evening, Dean had shown me that I was so lucky that I had found someone that was of the same moral set, had the same ethics that I did, cared about people the same way that I did, and wanted to tell a true story about what we had experienced that night, and in those surrounding days. And for me, what Dean brought to the table was a humanity, a piece of the connection that was missing from all of this. What was happening at the ground level for the people that are noticing and interacting with this phenomenon when it occurs. And he told me that we were going to tell a different story, that we were going to talk about what we derived from that interaction. What could we say about whatever this phenomena is, whether it's alien or some other strange thing that we don't understand. And from what I've seen from the work that he's done, he really started to capture that. And I want to see more from him, and I want to see more people talking about what happened at the ground level. And then corroborating that information with the data we have gives us a much better picture of what people have experienced and what we may be dealing with. That it doesn't seem like, frankly, the government is going to share that information with us right now.
So, Sean, can I just get into your brain a little bit, though? Because you and I have spoken before about how profound an experience this was for you. And I think one of the things that interests me is this was quite a spiritual thing for you, wasn't it, this encounter? It was a real wake-up. Can you tell me, if we're looking at a film from the alien perspective, if you like, what do you think was the intention of whatever the beings or the intelligent, sentient creatures that might have been behind those objects? What was their intention that day in 2004?
It's a very good question. Some people might ask why out of 400 crew members or myself and Kevin Day people that speak up about this. Not only, there were other people that were involved. In the past, I was more reticent to discuss this, but Kevin and I are both two men who have been experiencing this phenomena for as long as we can remember. It goes all the way back to our childhoods. It intersects with numerous points in our lives and other people in our lives. And we've sought answers for this. I don't have a good answer for it because I still think we're missing data on that event. But there seems to be something occurring that certain individuals, certain people are noticing things in the environment, whether their brains are operating on a different frequency, Whether their state of mind has something to do with it, there's a great deal of data involved in that. I have to say, though, if I'm going to be courageous in my answer, that after all these years, I do think there is something to the phenomenon that is trying to wake humanity up.
Exactly.
And trying to wake them up to an aspect of our existence that we're not paying attention to, and something that is just incredibly important to our continued existence to pay attention to and to interface with. And I know it's confusing, especially when you have the military and the intelligence complex running point on this subject. But there does seem to be something involving consciousness and awareness that we need to focus on, I believe.
So, Dean, let's talk about that, because to me, I've always been struck with Sean. I've always admired your honesty and your candor, Sean, in speaking so openly about how profound that experience was for you. And I've always been intrigued by the fact that there were earlier experiences in your life that may in fact be connected to the broader experience that you had with the phenomenon. What's your take on that, Dean? What do you think of the idea that essentially what the phenomenon is trying to do is twig us, make us aware of it, and do something in our consciousness?
Yeah, you know full well, Ross. I mean, your book, Hide in Plain Sight, you know this is a deep rabbit hole. And when it grabs you, it pulls you in. I was expecting to do a documentary that would be 9 months of my time, 15 interviews, done. And then I go to NASA and I'm like, what is the protocol for when you guys actually find a civilization where you can see a light grid and cities and everything? And she got the giggles, and I have this on camera. She has no idea what they do. There's no protocol at NASA for that. So then I have to go and find out. And as soon as you do that, it's this viral thing that keeps going and going. And so when I went to interview Sean, I knew in my brain that I was going to be taking the Tic-Tac incident and taking it outside of this footage that could be almost mistaken, some of it, for the game of Pong. You know, if you're as old as I am, you remember that little disc going back and forth. And because I'm a little bit dyslexic and I'm a filmmaker because of that, probably because I'm a visual person, I wanted to present that where people could actually see it. And so that's when I went after this animator who's done films for Academy Award-winning films, Arvid Steen, to actually reenact that. And so you get to see inside the cockpit of Commander Fravor. You get to see it from the Tic-Tac's perspective. But getting back to your main question,
can I just say congratulations on that, by the way. It's a fantastic looking film, beautifully shot, lush, gorgeous production. But I think some of the most exciting stuff for me was the animation. And just to talk to what you do, it's when Dave Fravor, for example, is talking about how he was in that tracking corkscrew with the Tic-Tac as it was coming up to him, and he was corkscrewing down, and then he decided to turn on his wing and zoom across the clock face, as they call it, towards this object. And you show beautifully how literally the Tic-Tac's right in front of his cockpit, and then it just goes, disappears.
Yeah. Well, I didn't want to do 3D. I wanted to do 2D. It's all hand drawn. It's like really exceptional work. But when I put that together, it all starts with the interviews, right? And so when I interviewed Sean, I thought I'm going to get kind of the logistics of this, but because I've worked on crime shows for 20 years, I tend to go a little bit deeper because I want to talk about how it affected them. What is the takeaway? Not just that moment, but the residual effect. Like you had asked Sean about that. How does that affect you? And that blew my socks off. I mean, first of all, Sean is an extremely articulate person, has a great vocabulary when it comes to describing anything, and can concisely condense what it is that he felt. And so when I was talking to him, it became this thing where both of us got a little emotional as we were walking through this. This affected him on so many levels. And it wasn't just, bam, here you go, here's the brain dump. It was this time release thing. And so when I hear people say, you know, oh, experience or this or that, I'm going, you do know that experiencers aren't just people who are taken, abductees. There are people who are connecting. That is an experience. And so the levels that Sean is comfortable with sharing, which he did in the film and now, you know, personally, is a real testament to someone that is experiencing something that is a communion, as Whitley would say, with
Can I,
a higher intelligence, and why is that happening?
can I ask you this? How many, because you did a phenomenal job going around the world talking to some of the more interesting people on the UAP issue, particularly a lot of UAP experiences. How many of the UAP experiences that you've interviewed have had the same experience as Sean, where, yes, they've had this one incident, be it the Ariel incident or the Rendlesham incident, but it always turns out in a large percentage of these cases, when they look back in their family history, there's something there. It might be a granny who saw spirits, or it might be a grandfather who saw a UFO when he was in the World War II. How often did you have that experience when you were doing the research?
Well, I have to caveat this. But first, most of them, there were some traces of this in their past. I say caveat because I'm not an experiencer that I'm aware of. My mother saw a UFO in the Bay Area off the water. She saw it look like it came out of the water. She thought it was a boat or submarine or something. It was dusk. It came up and then paused and then took off like it smeared the sky. I've been wanting to see this since I was a kid. And so Yvonne Smith, who has been gracious enough to let me go to abductee or experiencer support groups, and I've gone to a few. In fact, I'm one of the only filmmakers who's been allowed to film there, and that's a whole other documentary that I'll hopefully come back on your show and tell you about. I said to her, I go, why am I doing this? Because I've been at this for 7 years now, and it's got such a pull on me. And sometimes when I'm editing, I feel this like rush, this energy, almost like, the hair back of my neck stands up. And I said, but I've come through my past. I have no memory, missing time, etc. And she laughed at me and said, Dean, they don't have to knock on your door to connect with you, which was both kind of scary and revealing. And so when I talk to these experiencers, I want to know that. I want to know what happened in your childhood. Were you always interested in this? And it doesn't really it's kind of like this memory that gets jogged when they have it as an adult. It's like, hey, remember us? And I'm curious to hear Sean talk about that some more. But inevitably, there was something that happened. I don't know if it's because, again, they're chosen or they're open to it. I think that might be it. But
Sean, can I ask you, I don't want to put you on the spot because you don't have to talk about it if you don't want to, but what were the kind of early experiences and senses that you had as a child before the whole USS Princeton incident?
There were some that were as a very young child. We had an incident around Christmas where my sister had come into my room, and there was something on the roof. I was convinced it was Santa Claus, and she told me it was Santa Claus, but she was incredibly frightened. She was absolutely terrified. And we ended up spending the whole night in my room. I must have been 5 or 6 years old. And we ended up against the door to my room on the floor with me kind of in a headlock hug that she had put me in. And as embarrassing as it is, I remember wetting my pants trying to get away from her because I wanted to see Santa Claus, and she was crying. There were events surrounding that Christmas that were so strange that I have to attribute it to the phenomenon. In later years, in high school, I was involved in something with a couple of friends where we had all seen a beautiful meteor, just a giant green football moving slowly across the sky and spitting out these sparks out of the back that looked like it was from an old 1920s Buck Rogers film. Frankly, it looked ridiculous. And my memory of that was that we went back to my house and wrote songs for the band that night and talked about seeing that and kind of all separated and wrote it down, and that was it, and moved on. And years after meeting Luis Elizondo and kind of sitting down and going back through my memories, I called those two friends up, and they said they had a completely different memory of the evening, where we had driven up to Mount Hamilton Observatory chasing after this thing, and that I had exited the car and interacted with blue orbs in the parking lot of the Hamilton Observatory while they hid in the car. And I have no memory of that. And that probably, if anything, bothers me more. But even in the years after Tic-Tac, I witnessed a incredibly large black triangle come over my house. which was definitely not a prosaic bomber I've guarded the B-2. I've been underneath it. I've been around them constantly. It was certainly not a B-2 or even any of its successors that might still be classified. And more so than that, I have to say that after meeting many of the persons that were involved in these programs that ended up evolving into the UAPTF and evolving into Arrow, and many of the whistleblowers that are currently out, the hitchhiker effect that is described is a very real thing. And for a year or two after first getting involved in this community and in this research and spending so much time thinking about this subject, phenomena began to manifest in and around my home where my family was witnessing it as well. And that was really hard for them because they're not focused on this subject, interested. It's a peripheral thing in their life like it is for most people. And so it was very strange for my family to see these things happening and not understand. So
it's funny. I was just thinking as you were talking to me then about how Lou and Jen Elizondo have had similar experiences in their home.
Yeah.
And when I did an interview with Lou last year for his book, he's still a little bit shy about talking about some of those experiences. And I can understand why, because they just sound completely off the wall. Some of them are
He's given me permission to say that we've had experiences together while at his home. That my family was also present for, and witnessed and videotaped things that others believe they've debunked. But at this point, we still certainly have not, and we're all rather educated on the subject. I mean, I was a crash accident investigator as part of my duties in the Navy for aircraft, and I know what aircraft look like, especially on high definition video that I've taken myself that I was present for. So it's very strange. There's a familial aspect for me as well. My father was a World War II Foo Fighters witness while the waist gunner and radio operator on a B-17.
Oh, this does my head in. I'm amazed how often this runs in a family. I had a conversation with I'll have to be discreet here, a federal minister of the Australian government about 6 months ago, and it still sticks in my head because he told me this incredible story about how he was walking out of a government office in the middle of central Sydney, so very crowded street. There's thousands of people at lunchtime, and he's waiting for the Crown car to come and pick him up. Very important guy. And he's there with his press secretary standing there with a bundle of papers. And as he looks up, he sees this giant metallic egg hovering in the square. And he looks at his press secretary, and his press secretary is clearly oblivious to it. And this minister is a very important figure in one of our governments, our previous governments. And he said to me, Ross, I will deny this if you name me, but basically, I want you to know it's real. And more importantly, I just knew I had to ask him, just as a matter of interest, did your dad or your mum or your grandfather, your grandma, did they have experiences? And he looked, how did you know? And it runs in families, this. It's really weird. And I feel it's a disservice to the reporting on this subject matter that we often don't discuss this aspect of the phenomenon, that it seems to be familial. It seems to run in family lines. What's your take on that?
It's also weird that Sean and I, turns out, grew up in the same in the same town pretty much. We discovered that later. When I forgot how it came up, but yeah, we were hitting the same haunts.
Your cousin gave me a gold watch when we were in second grade.
I hope it wasn't stolen.
It was. I may have an Alioto family heirloom in my dresser.
So, Dean, let's talk about that. I was really thrilled to see you spoke to Salma Siddiq, who's one of the Ariel what do you call them, witnesses at the Ariel incident in Rua, Zimbabwe in, is it 1994? Yeah. I'm really struck for how profound those beautiful little children they found that experience of engaging with what appear to have been non-human intelligences on their account. Is there the similar kind of stuff in the background with Salma? I know that from the Randy Nickerson documentary, the school principal turned out to be having similar experiences to what we've just discussed. But is there something that you've found with those children, with those witnesses that you've spoken to, similar to what we're talking about?
Yeah, it's interesting because, again, when I started out, one doc, one and done. Well, it bloomed up to 4 episodes, and then those got so big that everything got bifurcated. So there's the Alien Perspective Part 1, then there's Part 2. Then there's 2 other documentaries. One is going to be all about John Mack. And then the other one is called The Experiencers. And Salma is in, I believe she might be in that, but she's definitely the John Mack stuff. And what's interesting is that when I interviewed her and was asking her about that very thing, she wasn't sure. Like here's the thing, Sean will tell you this. You have to be willing to go on that journey and go inward. Some things get lodged by having that experience as an adult. Other things don't. But you really have to sit with yourself and think about it and comb through, and you will find things. But I don't think that was, accidental. I mean, for me, I knew something else went on during that event, by the way. And in the John Mack doc, you're going to see what that was. There was something else that happened. And so I don't want to kind of give it away, but it wasn't just this thing. There was something else going on. And so I think that this is all part of something that is happening, an awakening that's happening. And the question is, why now? And I go, well, with technology, because the 2 messages that they say is your technology isn't helping you. And for the longest time, we thought, oh, it's nuclear weapons. I don't know that it's not smartphones, that it's not the technology we have now. And the other thing is, you're ruining your planet, and they show them images and everything. And so I kind of, wonder, because if you went back 100 years and you'd say technology is not helping, or 200 years, you go, oh, the printing press, that's bad. Now it's relevant. And so that's maybe why, this has been reported more so in the 1900s and 2000s.
Do you know, it's funny, Sean, I'm really struck by a Doctor Who episode I once watched. I sat there with my daughters and we watched it, and I've forgotten their names, but there are these creatures that you can only see out of the corner of your eye. And they're there, but they're just out of the realm of immediate direct consciousness. And I just have this gut feeling, because I've spoken to Lou, like you have, about some of the really weird phenomena that he's had. And I know and I empathize with you that a lot of what you've experienced is quite personal, and you probably don't want to talk in a lot of detail about it. And Dean, I'm sure there are lots of witnesses that you've interviewed for this film who've described this phenomena. There's the one main experience that we all focus on. But I just have this worry that what's really most important is what's going on just out of the corner of our eye, that there is a motive by whatever this intelligence is that goes a lot further than just one individual incident, be it the USS Nimitz incident in 2004, the Rua, Zimbabwe aerial sightings in 1994. What's going on? I mean, I know you don't have the answer, but speculate for me, Sean.
My response to this at first, after Tic-Tac, to be completely honest, was to run in the other direction from spirituality. The response of my chain of command and the response of those in leadership on board the ship at that time in my career had told me that what we were dealing with was understood. No, there's nothing to be afraid of. Get back to work. The big guys know what's going on. And now I understand that that's not true. That was just denial. That was just business as usual, and those folks moving on with their own lives. They had no interest in latching on to this whatsoever. But my response was actually to become rather self-destructive in my life. I went down, I had a period of alcoholism, a period of very selfish behavior. And part of it was because for me, the universe had just become nuts and bolts. It had just become math, and I wasn't going to get to know the mysteries. They probably weren't real anyway. And then that became such a burden, that self-abuse became such a burden that I finally broke and changed my lifestyle. I began meditating. I began practicing yoga, but practicing deep meditation while in the yoga, not just the Americanized group stretching, which is great for your health, but it's not the same as what's as the reasoning behind the asanas and the different positions. But what I found was something inside of me that transcended everything else around me. I found an observer that was not concerned with the abuses I had been through in my life, that didn't need to win the race and didn't need to eat the cookie. And that showed me that there was something that at the heart of this, it's one thing to tell us all that our nuclear weapons are destructive. I think we know that our environmental practices are destructive. We know that. And that our wars are destructive. We know that, and yet we do them anyway. And we engage in this behavior every day because we have a 50-50 set of people, some of us selfish and some of us less so. And that what that does is create an environment where being your true and honest self is no longer something that is conducive to your survival. You must participate in this society of greed and want and need to have a proper life with your loved ones. And if there's anything I think they're waking us up to, it's that at the core of our actions, it's not about the bomb. It's not about the war. It's not about the pollution. It's about what's in our heart when we're committing those acts in our own home and against each other. And I don't think we understand that yet. And if we're lucky, they're here to tell us about that. And if we're not, they're here to pull one over on us and act the same way that we're acting to each other.
I might as well ask you this, Sean. Do you buy into, because there's two debates in ufology. One is the threat narrative, and the other is they're all lovey-dovey. And I don't ascribe to either of them. I think there's probably some malevolent, some benevolent, if there is life forms, and I'm sure there are. Isn't it a silly debate, that polar debate, whether or not there's a threat narrative behind the whole alien issue or whether they're benevolent? I know Dr. Stephen Greer, for example, gets very frustrated with the idea that we sometimes talk about a threat, that Lou Elizondo talks about the possibility of a threat being posed. But in and of itself, you're a military man by training. Isn't something we don't understand a threat?
Absolutely. As a law enforcement officer, we talked about opportunity, intent, and capability when we were discussing suspects and the use of force and deadly force. The phenomena has the opportunity and the capability to do nearly anything it wants. It seems to defy physics. It seems to, at times, control the people, or at least manipulate their consciousness when they're interacting with them. All of these things are they're illegal if they were occurring within our society. So they're things that we cast moral aspersion on. The fact is, the phenomena does not make it easy for it to interact with. Regardless of what Stephen Greer says, sitting down and meditating is like opening up without understanding your intention, what you're aiming for, or what you're talking to. You have no idea. It's like picking up your telephone and just wondering if someone's going to be on the other side. You don't have a number you're dialing. You don't know. And it's clear that this phenomena understands our own consciousness better than we do. So while I won't say that the phenomena itself is negative, many of my experiences were borderline terrifying. If they are so advanced and so intelligent, I would appreciate an email or a phone call. And I don't mean to be flippant. You could send me an email and say, hey, come meet the phenomena in this field at this time, and we'll shake hands and and you don't have to be scared. But they don't do that. And so we're at a spot with the phenomenon where many are coming out and talking about psionics. They're talking about meditating. The term coined by Stephen Greer, CE5, which I don't include in J. Allen Hynek's CE 1 through 4. I think that's for Mr. Greer alone, because it's not fair to say that you're calling in spaceships. I don't believe that what people are interacting with when they go into a beautiful place inside and meditate and phenomena manifest, I don't believe that's the same thing that may have been retrieved in 1947 by the US government. And I don't think it's the same thing that we send out paramilitary teams that rumor says are now conflicting with each other to retrieve these materials. I don't think anything I would pray through my heart to needs a vehicle to arrive here. And I'm not a religious man, But I think that we're really muddying the water by suddenly saying that you can sit down and meditate and control a spacecraft.
I agree. In fact, thank you for those very profound comments. Dean, you've had the opportunity to travel the world and talk to some of the most interesting brains as commentators, but also experiencers on this issue. You call your film The Alien Perspective. As Sean's describing there seems to be some method behind the madness because, I like Sean often think, why the hell don't these intelligences, if they exist, why don't they just manifest themselves? Why don't they just show themselves and be far more overt and put the mystery to rest? In the heart of it, isn't that the fundamental mystery behind whatever this intelligence is? And have you got an answer for me? Why? Why don't these intelligences, as Sean describes, they operate in such a weird way? They're just there out of the corner of our eye, trying to twig our consciousness. They've always been there, and I'm profoundly struck by how many people I've spoken to who are experiencers. When you needle them a bit, sometimes they don't even realize it, and they call me back a few days later and they go, you know what? I did have a granny who said she saw strange things in the kitchen once. People often realize after the fact that it's always... Why is that? What's going on?
All right, so this answer is going to blow everyone's mind, and they're going to just get so many numbers. It's just going to go nuts. You ready for this? The first thing I learned in the first year of the 7 years of this documentary was all the stuff that I didn't know that I thought I knew. I think where I've arrived at, and I'm agnostic, I'm spiritual, but I try to be open to everything because first law is no one knows anything, is that this is being controlled by them. I don't worry that much. It doesn't keep me up at night worrying about us being taken over, because it would be very simple for them to send the size of like fruit fly drones and drop some chemical that would melt humans, leave the animals if they want. You could assign it to certain DNA of a creature and then just move in. That's not the case. What they seem to be doing is observing us like we would observe, tag, if you will, bears in the wild and everything. We are animals and we forget that. Proof of animals is that we fight and we're very emotional. We haven't gotten to a place, transcendental and otherwise, where we realize, oh, if I hurt this person, I'm hurting myself. So I think they're keeping everything at bay. But I do this thing where I walk people through, what is the wish fulfillment? Well, the wish fulfillment is that, like you just said, Ross, they show up on the White House lawn. Let's walk through that. They show up, they don't get shot down. Miraculously, they land. The alien gets out. Then a spokesperson has to go up to them. Now, if we go with the UFO beliefs and stories that are corroborated across the board, across countries, it's all telepathic. So now you've got to rely on the person who is the spokesperson to accurately convey what he's doing. So that doesn't really work. How far does the telepathy reach? Does he have to do a whistle stop tour like Teddy Roosevelt and go from town to town? And then what are they going to really be teaching us that we need to learn? I mean, we keep saying, well, we'd love to have technology, but we pervert all technology, right? So we're not at that level. And we go, well, we'd like to have them clean up the pollution here. And I keep going, so you want your a parent to come and clean it up and say, now keep it the way it is. We won't. So I think we need to listen to what they're saying, and we need to work on ourselves and know that we are going to get there. And the proof that we're going to get there, where we do have that communion, is that they're not giving up. They keep coming and coming, and they're shaping certain things and technology and getting us to a certain place. But we have to do half the work. I always say we've got to meet them halfway on the bridge. One other little thing is I think that these experiencers, and this is a belief I have, and I hope no one's offended by it, but I do believe a lot of them, and John Mack talks about this, that they agreed to do this in another life. And there's some belief, there's a term belief that they have maybe come from their planet or their future, if they're from the future or another dimension. And this is all a reason. And I know this because when I went to my first experience of support group, I said, guys, what you're telling me is terrifying. I couldn't deal with it. I couldn't deal with seeing a monkey come around the deck in broad daylight on my deck. It would freak the crap out of me because it's out of context, let alone an alien. So you guys are so terrified by this. Show me, raise up your hands. How many people would, if they could go back, have this not happen after you've told me all this? And there's 15 people in this room, from lawyers, doctors, etc. And I said, raise your hand if you would still do this again. Every single one of them raised their hands.
Yeah. I think that's really interesting because everybody I've spoken to thinks that the experience, albeit, as Sean says, at times terrifying, it's the most profound thing they've ever had happen in their life. And I'm amazed. I mean, as a journalist who's done a lot of confronting stories about crime and corruption, I don't think I've ever had so many intense emotional conversations with people as I have had doing the research that I've done for this investigation. Sean, Richard Dolan is one of the, I think, preeminent commentators in this field. And he gave a great speech the other day where he talked about how people should really be careful what they wish for when they just wish, frankly, let's just find out the secret and have done with it. And he actually talked about the possibility that whatever this phenomenon is, it might be so far advanced that it's completely beyond our ken, that essentially it's completely indifferent to us like we are to ants. And I'm really struck by the fact that earlier in the conversation we had, you talked about the commanders, the people above you on that bridge, probably the admiral or the captain of the vessel, who seemed to be aware of what this phenomenon was. And it's interesting because that's the narrative that, frankly, pisses me off, that there is one part of society, which is government, people in the know, some sections of the military and the intelligence community. And I'm often struck by how often when I talk to some of these people privately, including people inside the program, inside the retrieval and reverse engineering program, and they tell me that the phenomenon is demonic, that it's evil. They talk about angels, and they see this through the prism of evangelical Christianity in particular. What do you think of that take, Sean?
I was raised Catholic. I never voluntarily participated in it. And as a young teenager, I made a proclamation that I would not return to church. And I never did unless it was a wedding or a funeral, to be honest with you. I had a lousy relationship with what we all call God up until probably my late 30s, early 40s, when I began meditating. And when I began understanding finally that if you were willing to, you could find the piece of yourself that's more than flesh. And that, at least from my experience, it wasn't connected to any dogma or faith. And so then it became an investigation of the various world's religions and their various practices. And how do the holy people of those sects interact with their phenomena that they call God? I think we're dealing with a universe that we have looked at in a binary fashion, that we look at as either black or white, off or on, and occasionally a small gray area in the middle. But what we don't seem to understand yet is that everything in this universe is on a spectrum of some kind. And whether it's light, energy, matter, everything is vibrating. All of those things are important distinctions to make. Everything is truly connected, even if we don't feel it or can't parse how it's connected, if we can't see those connections. The fractality of the universe tells us that we are inside of a system that we just call life, and it's more complex than that. At the end of the day, the phenomena seems to understand it better than we do. But on that spectrum, your personal brain waves, body state, level of stress, level of cortisol, they change how your brain operates. They change whether it's operating in beta, alpha, theta, gamma, delta, all of which have different meanings that most people won't know, but some mean sleep, some mean alert and stressed out, some mean relaxed, and some mean incredible data processing. All people are in one of those states at all times. And I believe that when we are in what we tend to call a low vibrational state, which could be alcoholism, trauma, abuse, drug addiction, depression, things like that, our brainwaves are operating at such a lower frequency that I believe that other things within this reality that, as you said, we only see out of the corner of our eye at that 45-degree angle for a moment, those things exist with us. We don't understand them, and some of those things bring negative energy and feelings with them. Other things, if you go in the other direction and try to bring the purity that's talked about at the very core teachings of our religions, if you try to truly open your heart to selfless love and to see the other as yourself, there's a different thing waiting at that end of the brainwave spectrum that wants your attention. And I think both of those things are existing at the same time in our reality, and we tend to call them the phenomena. And I'll wrap up by saying, of the thousands and thousands of anecdotal reports that we've all the three of us have seen and researched over the years, we know that there are numerous different shapes, sizes, morphologies, bodies, languages, operations. Everything occurs differently. Although there are things that are similar, whatever this is, it's not one source. And I think it would behoove the three of us, as perhaps as leaders in this field or as people that will be listened to ensure that people understand that though we say phenomena, that is a plural, not a singular.
So, Dean, have you had similar profound senses of some kind of spiritual shove behind the interviews that you've done with these people?
Yeah, when I started out, I thought this is going to be an informative science documentary. Well, I'm going to ground the phenomenon.
I thought I was going to debunk this story of UFOs and get on with writing a book about US secret technology. Sorry,
that's what I told Lou Elizondo I wanted to help with. I said, if anybody's full of it from the Princeton, let me know.
Yeah.
Forgive me, Sean, I interrupted. Forgive me, Dean. I apologize.
No, so it became this thing where I realized, oh, this is part of my journey. I'm being of service. And that's always been important to Sean and I, is how can we be of service? And so when I look at this and I look at all these people that are going through this, I'm right where I should be. I believe, not to prophesize this, but I'm here to kind of shed light on it and maybe add a piece to the puzzle that you're adding, Ross, and others are adding. But I feel like it is something that is extremely profound on so many different levels that it's kind of like, again, time released. And so as much as we want to have all the answers and we want a UFO tailpipe to be dropped on the next congressional House hearing and go, wow, here it is. And here's a dead alien arm. For the thousands, hundreds of thousands, who knows how more experiencers, they've had that, communion with them. And so I feel like it's part of our evolution, because we're going to be doing that very same thing. We are going to discover time travel. It's inevitable. Einstein predicted it. And we're also going to be able to discover new physics that are going to take us to other dimensions of planets. And so, you got to respect the prime directive. But there's certain things that they're doing that feels like they're almost authors in our existence. And as Lou would say, Lou told me at that same, Comic-Con convention, he said a portion of the generals he talks to when he was briefing them say, you're doing God's work, right? And another portion says, they're demons, right? And so it comes down to the limitations of one's imagination. And whenever because I'm a writer, I can't afford to be too rigid, to be too brittle, and to close up my toolbox and say, I have everything I need in here. Can't do that. I have to be open to everything. And so I found that the one common denominator in all this is that there is a spiritual component here where they do want us to get to a certain level where we are all not kind of like a hive mentality where, again, we're all here experiencing this wonderful thing. We are gifted. I mean, I'm excited about finding another planet that's Earth-like, but the odds that it's going to have the right gravity, the right sun, the right distance, all these things that's perfect, we have something that is so amazing. And so at the end of these 7 years, I find myself looking at these documentaries and realize that there's two messages that came through for me. One is to have empathy for the experiencers. That needs to stop now, because you wouldn't say to someone who got abducted by someone, you wouldn't say, oh, was the van white or was it black? Was there duct tape or rope? They do that with aliens. They go, oh, it was a ship. Was it triangular? Was it whatever? That stops now. And the second thing is that our planet is this amazing gift, and we are connected with it as much as it is with us. And we can destroy it as much as we think we can, but it'll recycle. So I'm more worried about mankind. I want our race at the end of the day to be the ones that get to be fully evolved, because if we don't make it, there's going to be another intelligence that's going to come out of this. And so it's incumbent upon us to handle the inheritance that we have and to treat it right, and to also enjoy that we don't have all the answers. You know, right now, the aliens, if you will, and non-human intelligence, they're giving us teasers and trailers to a fantastic movie that we're eventually going to get to see.
Well, Dean and Sean, I have a sense both of you are right, that essentially what's happening is we are being twigged. Our consciousness is being twigged by something sentient and something intelligent. But as Sean says, it's a journey that we have to make as a spiritual journey on our own in order to be able to comprehend it. Thank you, both of you, for joining Reality Check, and I wish you the very luck with your film, The Alien Perspective. Just remind us again, Dean, where can we watch it?
Sure. You can see it on Amazon or Apple TV, and I'll also be posting about it on my Instagram at Dean Alioto.
And Sean, when are you going to write a book? Come on, I want to hear
it. I'm receiving quite a bit of encouragement to do so. I've considered it. Right now, I'm mostly focused on the company I've started with a few other people called Project Nanu. We're creating a social media platform where people who are experiencers or just very generally interested in the phenomena and other mysteries of the world can unite and share their evidence with each other. We look forward to releasing that this summer. But I appreciate the poke there. Maybe I'll let you know if I start writing one.
Thank you to both of you. And before we go, please don't forget to send in your questions for our weekly question and answer. You can email us at realitycheck@newsnationnow.com. We look forward to hearing from you. G'day and welcome back to Reality Check. I'm your host, Ross Coulthart, and this week I'm very excited because we're telling the story of one of my favourite UFO UAP sightings of all time. And who better to help us tell that story than a former British police detective, Gary Heseltine, the founder and editor of the UK UFO Truth magazine. Gary's spent many years investigating what I suspect is one of the most important UAP sightings ever. It's the Rendlesham Forest incident of December 1980, a sighting of, shall we say, a possible non-human craft in a forest close to the twin bases of RAF Bentwaters and RAF Woodbridge on the East Anglian coast in the county of Suffolk, England. It's a case known as Britain's Roswell. It's a site with an intriguing history. A nearby location called Orford Ness is where radar was first developed, and early atomic weapons development began there in the 50s, and then in the 70s the same site was used for a top-secret experimental over-the-horizon radar system delightfully named Cobra Mist. This is an area stooped in military secrets, and who better to tell us all about it than Gary Heseltine? G'day, Gary.
It's a delight to be on your show. Thank you for inviting me.
Now, Gary, you're the author of a new book on this subject. Tell us all about your book. When did that come out, and where can people get hold of it?
Well, the book was self-published, and there is a story behind that, which we'll go into, no doubt. It was published on Amazon, self-published on Amazon, and released in February of 2023.
And the title?
Non-Human, and by magic, there's the book. Non-Human, the Rendlesham Forest UFO Incidents, i.e. plural, 42 Years of Denial. We can talk about why I chose that title if you wish.
So, Gary, a lot of people may think they know the Rendlesham Forest story. You know, everybody's heard the audio of Colonel Charles Holt, the deputy base commander, who went out into the forest on what I think was the second of three interesting nights that took place at that time. And it's quite chilling audio of the colonel describing what he and a host of British and American people saw that night. But what I'm really interested to start you off with is, what do people not understand about the Rendlesham story? What have we not yet understood that you think is the primary revelation from this extraordinary encounter?
I researched the story a long time ago and thought I knew it. But when I was asked to get involved in a documentary as a lead researcher, I thought, well, if I'm going to put my name to it, it best be accurate. So I decided to do a reinvestigation of everything about the case from literally days afterwards. And that process actually took me on a journey that took 5 years. And then I realized I had so much material, both old and new, that had never seen the light of day anywhere, that I thought the public would need to see, that I decided to write a book, and the book took 3 years. The first thing that you really have to understand with Rendlesham is I think it's arguably the most complicated UFO story in history. And that's because it has many different layers. There's different agendas by governments. There's media downplaying it. There's multiple agendas possibly at play with some of the military witnesses. It's an evolving story. And it's an evolving story because at the end of my book, I detailed 17 different timed UFO events. 17 different timed events, not over 2 or 3 days as we originally thought, but stretching now to about a week period. Because during the course of that reinvestigation, I came across a witness who actually talked about an incident on the 23rd of December, which of course nobody had ever heard of at that point.
Okay, so what is the thing that people don't know about Rendlesham that you think they should know? What's the thing that leaps out to you most about the case?
That there's far more witnesses who've never seen the light of day in front of a camera being interviewed. I think the biggest story is that the narrative of the case has been controlled pretty well for probably the last 25 years at least.
So, for the benefit of our audience that don't know the Rendlesham story, and you and I are total addicts. I've spent time trotting around that forest in Suffolk and had a ball trying to figure out who saw what and when. Let's just go through the basics of what we understand happened in that December period in 1980.
Well, the original story, I should say really up to 2017 before the reinvestigation, was that there had been... The incident occurred in late December 1980, and it basically involves US Air Force security police at a twin base complex, like you said, RAF Bentwaters and RAF Woodbridge in Suffolk, which is about 80, 90 miles north of London. What made it interesting in terms of becoming a worldwide famous case is when this memorandum was released in a big newspaper headline in October of 1983, nearly 3 years after the actual events. And the title was pretty impressive: UFO lands in Suffolk and it's official.
And it's official. That's a great news of the world headline.
Oh,
yes.
Absolutely. But what made it official is that they got a hold of this, what now turns out to be this very famous US Air Force document called the Holt Memorandum, which was this one-page memo that Colonel Holt, then a lieutenant colonel, the deputy base commander of what was a nuclear base, and we'll talk about that in no doubt. He wrote a memo about 2 weeks after the events to the Ministry of Defence because he was told to by the base commander, Colonel Williams. Holt did not want to write the letter. He really wanted to just keep out of it, even though he'd got caught up in the events. But he was told, no, you need to let the British know, because essentially what the Americans were saying was that this had all happened on British soil. It wasn't on the bases, it was on British soil. And what you have to understand is if you've got Bentwaters there and Woodbridge there, in that middle, you can basically say there was the forest, Rendlesham Forest. So it had effectively happened on British soil, and as a courtesy, the story was write a memo, let them know. Holt writes a one-page teaser. It really was a teaser, and he played it down. Unexpected lights, he didn't call it UFO, but what the document did that was amazing, really, is one, it was on a US Air Force headed paper, so when it came out, they couldn't say that it wasn't anything to do with the Air Force, that they didn't know about it. But the 3 paragraphs are pretty amazing, because the first paragraph says that effectively on what was then deemed the first night, 2 airmen had got very close to what would appear to be a mechanical object that had landed or at or near the ground, hovering on the ground, in a small clearing in the forest. Now, this is a triangular object, approximately 3 meters by 3 meters in dimensions, with 2 meters height. And basically, one of the key witness to that description was Sergeant Jim Peniston, who was very well thought of by his colleagues. He said he walked around it, touched it, didn't have a clue, said it was warm to the touch, it was like glass, it was effectively black in colour with some self-emanating lights that would kind of just drift through from within. He said at one point he found raised etchings, like the etchings on your windscreen, and he said he came across some symbols. He said he took photographs, which he later claimed he was told that they'd come out fogged for whatever reason. Maybe that's true, maybe that's a cover-up. But he said he took photographs, he walked around it, touched it, he wrote it in his pocketbook. So that was essentially one thing in that first paragraph. The second paragraph was, it then went into the dimensions of that investigation, including the fact that depressions were found in the ground, which effectively gave it like a tripod appendage, a landing gear, and they were all pressed to the same size and weight of depression, which some people have estimated to be just over a ton. But that's pure speculation. But there were 3 ground depressions. And what that basically said is that there was some physical evidence there to corroborate the fact that they'd seen this object at or near the ground. Then the last paragraph, which for me has always been the most important, because Lieutenant Colonel Charles Holt, Deputy Base Commander of a nuclear base, actually said he went out in the forest with his own team, and whilst in the forest they saw multiple UFOs himself, and then he signed it. Now, we don't have many documents in UFO archives that are signed by such a high-ranking person to having seen multiple UFOs. So for me, that's what elevates it to a special document. So that was a major revelation.
So Colonel Charles Holt, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Holt, who you mentioned, he was the deputy base commander. Is there any doubt in your mind that there were nuclear weapons on those bases?
No, during the course of my research, I spoke to 6 military personnel, many of whom had never been on the record in terms of documentaries and been interviewed, and they said they were guarding tactical nuclear weapons, which is low yield. Now, the interest I had in the case right from the first hearing about it was the fact that I'd served 6 years in the Royal Air Force Police, and for 3 of my 6 years, I'd done exactly the same job as them, as guarding nuclear weapons at RAF Honington in Suffolk and RAF Larbrook in what was then West Germany. So I kind of suspected there were a lot more witnesses.
Had you seen any anomalous phenomena over nuclear weapons or during your time in service?
No, amazingly, I didn't. In fact, having had a childhood sighting at the age of 16, I kind of put that to bed for a long time, just kind of watched it, if anything, got books on it. But after a few years, I really didn't do anything. And I don't recall anything during the Air Force at all, my 6 years.
So I had the privilege of meeting and interviewing Charles Holt quite a few years ago, back to about 10 years ago.
Good interview.
And he described what he saw moving through the trees in the forest with the team that he was with. He described it as a big red eye that was moving between the trees in the forest. And a lot of the skeptics, the debunkers, immediately leapt on the Orford Ness lighthouse. And that's always been used, if you like, as the kind of default debunk for the whole story, that all of these people were just freaking out because they saw a light in the forest, and what they didn't realize was that it was the light of the lighthouse. Let's deal with that debunk explanation straight away, Gary. What do you say to that?
As you would often say on your show, bullshit, absolute bullshit. It was ludicrous from the beginning. I met Holt. I had a 7-year collaboration period with him, and I actually met him on a couple of occasions. I walked through the forest with him, asking him to show me, go over to see if we could get any new information based on his tape recording. And he told me an absolute thing that's perfect. One, that he used to take people to Orford Ness Lighthouse himself when he had visitors to the base, because it was a nice, pretty area, and there were nice British pubs that you could take Americans to, etc. So, as they do. But the other thing that was most important is that when we were in the forest filming for a documentary that actually never aired, he'd come over, they brought him across, and we had some free time. And I said, can you retrace your steps based on your audio? Because I suspected nobody had ever done it. And we went around, and at one point, we're opposite what's called the farmhouse and the farmer's field. And the significance of that field, which is at the edge of the forest, which is effectively surrounded by the forest, but you come to a big, what was then a ploughed field. And this is 2010. And we stood by the edge of the field, and he said, look, this is where I first saw the object in the clear, i.e. not in amongst the trees. And so it'd been that followed it through the trees, described it as a red glowing object, maybe the size of a car, with a black center like an eye that seemed to be winking at you, and it appeared to be dripping molten metal. Well, they followed it through the forest underneath, and this is what a lot of people don't realize, underneath the canopy of the trees. The trees at the time were Corsican pines. Now, Corsican pines are not there now, because in 1987 there was a huge storm and 90% of the original trees were knocked over. So they were replanted, not Corsican pine. Now, the Corsican pine plays a vital part in the story because their leaves, as it were, and their branches don't begin until about 15, 20 feet off the ground, which is pretty substantial. So if you've ever, and you've been there, you will see that you have these rows of trees with big gaps between them. Well, imagine you've seen the new trees, the replanted trees, which are much smaller, and they're not the same trees, so their branches much lower down. Imagine back in 1980, you've got a 20-foot before you get to a branch. So anything seen underneath was very easy to pick up. So they followed it through the trees until it got to the edge of the farmer's field.
Let's cut to the quick on this, Gary. Do you think that what was seen in the forest that night and previous and other nights was a non-human technology of some kind?
Absolutely, yeah. It was anomalous. There were multiple events, and that's, I guess, when I did the cold case review as a former detective, I basically thought, well, I'll take sentiment out of this, I will stick to the facts and look for reasoned determinations. Now, with the new witnesses that emerged through my inquiry, I ended up with 17 different timed events. Well, all of these were anomalous, and we can go through many of them.
Okay, there's one thing I want to ask you though. Do you think Charles Holt, the lieutenant colonel in charge of deputy base commander, do you think he's told the whole story of what he actually saw in the forest?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not.
There are claims in your book that suggest that witnesses recorded Holt actually being in the presence of the craft.
That's not quite right. Let me just clarify. Holt denied, as soon as he retired, he denied that there was any talk of suggestion of aliens, life forms, or anything being seen in the forest. And that was because he was essentially debunking, as soon as he retired, I think 1991, as soon as he retired, he basically began to attack the original military whistleblower was called Larry Warren, a controversial figure, but only over time because the others attacked him. But at the time, he was the first one to say, my name is, go on camera, and I was a witness to this. Now, his story didn't match the story of Jim Penniston and John Burroughs, and it didn't match Colonel Holt's. So when Holt retired, he basically started saying, no, the guy wasn't there. He was kicked out of the Air Force, blah, blah, blah. And essentially, I was looking for corroboration, and I eventually found it with a very arguably the best linking witness to all of this, to the real story, was a guy called Sergeant Adrian Bustinza. And it took me 2 years to finally get him to agree because he'd been very traumatized.
What did he say he saw? Because
Well,
I'm very interested. I'm very interested in what Bustinza says he saw Charles Holt witness.
Well, he said that Charles Holt and the base commander, Colonel Gordon Williams, the guy in charge of the twin bases, were present in the field, in that farmer's field that I described earlier, to a second landing, which was the one that Larry Warren had said he'd been involved in. And basically,
was that on the same? Was that on the same night that Holt went on his patrol into the forest with his team?
According to Sergeant Adrian Bustinza, no. But that was an amazing admission that he made, because there I'm interviewing him for 4.5 hours in a transatlantic call. He'd finally got into the zone, as it were, and he'd been very reluctant in the past to talk about things. He'd not really done interviews. He'd made the odd statement on social media, but we had this 4.5 hours, and eventually he corroborates that there was a craft in the field, that it was surrounded by security police personnel, US Air Force security police personnel, that Larry Warren, the guy who'd come up with the original story of that second landing, was there next to him, actually closer to the craft than he was, that it was being filmed, not just with cameras, still cameras, but it was being filmed on early video, and it did exist in 1980, and cinefilm, which kind of a bit bizarre because it infers that they knew it was coming back. But this is, I think, still a developing story. But he eventually said to me, it's on another night. And I went, what? He said, it's not the same night as Holt.
Okay, this is one thing I've got trouble with, because I've read the account of, is it Bustinza, in your book?
Yep.
And I like you, I find him quite a credible and strong witness. He's very impressive.
Yeah.
But what it suggests is that Charles Holt has lied, not to put too fine a point on it. And I've always admired Charles Holt for having the courage to come out and verify not only that he wrote the memo and that he saw what he saw, but that he feels very strongly that what he saw that night was extraterrestrial. Why would, if it's true what Bustinza says, and Charles Holt and, is it Gordon Williams, the commander of the boat, were in the field, if it's true they were there when this craft landed on a subsequent occasion, why would Charles Holt not reveal that incident? That's, to me, I think, one of the most interesting aspects in your non-human book.
Well, let's imagine it this way. Had the story have broken that he said that there was a second landing, that it was being filmed, that the base commander was there in charge of 12,000 personnel and was there, and there was this, and it was filmed, then you could have had almost a disclosure moment then. So the real reason I think that it was all covered up, anything to do with aliens, was to deflect how good a case it was, to downplay the significance. And the story...
Why talk about it at all, though? I mean, why did Holt file that memo at the insistence of his base commander? Why did he file that memo that eventually found its way to the British Department of Defence? Why not just cover it up?
They have covered up a lot of things, but the story goes, according to Holt, that he was told to write it by Colonel Williams after he'd played him back the tape recorder of his night in the forest. And he said, well, it's happened on British soil. They didn't want to get involved. One, can we borrow the tape? And I'll take it to a meeting, the next general's meeting. And then basically write a memo. It's on British soil. We kind of want to wash our hands of it. And I think everything that's come out is a cover-up, because you talked about the lighthouse. It was ludicrous. You've got 17 different incidents. It's ludicrous for every single one. Some were even in the opposite directions.
Do you know what really gets my goat is at the time that I did that Rendlesham story, I really didn't understand enough
Yes.
of the position of the lighthouse, which is on a completely different bearing from where Holt says he was looking. And I was snowed. I came away initially thinking, gee, there must just be a bunch of hysterical security police thinking that they've seen a UFO, but really all they did was see a lighthouse light through the trees. It kind of sounded plausible to me, but it's not until, as you've done, you do the homework, you go there, you look at and retrace the steps and figure out what people say they saw, and you realize it's a load of hogwash. And that's the thing that really leapt out at me about this case, is that there has been disinformation on an extraordinary scale.
Yes. The lighthouse theory was made up entirely by the BBC as a response. An astronomer, Ian Ridpath, did this famous video where he's there at night with a BBC film crew, and they're saying, "Oh, look, it's the lighthouse in the distance. Oh, look, every 5 seconds, boom," and you'd see a flash. But the reality is, if they'd have played that for a full minute, it wouldn't have matched the audio. But he chose literally a 10-second piece out of Holt's audio and then matched it and said, "Look, there it goes. They obviously saw the lighthouse." It was made up by the media, who I think at the very highest levels, probably on a D notice, were told, you must play this incident now.
Okay, so let's get into the nitty-gritty of witnesses.
Yeah.
I've always, I have to admit, assumed the slurs on Larry Warren were true. I'd always thought
everybody did.
I'd always thought Larry Warren was self-promoting and that it wasn't true what he said, because it didn't fit with what Jim Penniston and Charles Holt said, or John Burroughs. Let's go through what Larry Warren says he saw and when. He was on the first night, wasn't he?
No, absolutely.
I thought he was on the 26th or the 27th.
Right, there's a real misnomer about the dates. And it's probably never going to be established now. Simply too much time has gone along. But what you're after is trying to piece the story together as best you can. Now, we do have some dates, but if you think about the Holt Memorandum, he changed the dates later on when it came out and said, no, it was actually a day earlier. Each incident was a day earlier. But I'm pretty certain that the original dates were probably true. And there's been a bit of shenanigans there to play it down.
Okay, so what was the first date?
The first date until the reinvestigation was essentially the night of the 25th into the 26th. So Christmas night into Boxing night. That's the first night landing, as it were, with Sergeant Jim Penniston and Airman John Burroughs.
Okay, talk me through what happened.
Well, effectively, a patrol with Sergeant Steffens and Airman John Burroughs were doing a routine drive along the country road, public road, on the way to the back gate of RAF Woodbridge. As they were just about to turn towards RAF Woodbridge, and there's that long road up to what was classed as the East Gate, and obviously you've been there, so you're aware of that, they saw some lights in the forest to their left. So they stopped there. This is not from the East Gate like everybody thinks. They stop there. They go into the forest for a little walk, and they see lights in the distance underneath the canopy, and they're a bit concerned. Is it an aircraft crashing or some incident? So they then drive up to the gate, go through the gate, use the telephone there to ring it into the Central Security Control. They then request another mobile to go there, which is Sergeant Jim Penniston and his driver, Airman Ed Kabanzek. So they all meet up, the four of them, at the East Gate, which is about 300 metres from the edge of the forest as you look from the East Gate now. And they saw lights moving around just above the treetops. Red, yellow, white lights moving around. Sergeant Jim Penniston then said, look, I want permission to go out. So they got permission to leave. Sergeant Steffens, interestingly, who was one of the original two to see the lights, he got pretty frightened by what he'd seen in that little short walk into the forest. And he got frightened because when he got back to his vehicle, there was a white spherical object, just a light, sat on the road approximately 20, 30 meters away from their vehicle. And that
Wow.
kind of freaked him out. And it might well freak me out or you out. But when he went back, he was scared. And he said, I don't want to go back out there. So that's how Eamon Burrows went, joined up with Ed Cabanzak and Sergeant Jim Pennison. So they go into the forest. Now, it gets confusing because Jim Pennison will say that at one point the radio started breaking up. So he said to Eamon Ed Cabanzak, you stay here and act as a radio relay. And and it's often the case, and I can validate this from my time in the Air Force Police, that we did things like that. You could bounce the signal off. But Jim Pennison will say that the two of them went forward. Eventually they see the lights, and eventually they come to a clearing. Now, the story of Jim and John is totally different. Jim Pennison will say that he's the one that's got closest to it, and he's walked around, it's touched it, it's a physical object. Whereas John Burroughs was perhaps 20, 30 meters behind him, maybe blinded by the lights, but he says he saw a bank of lights that suggested there was a structure behind it. Now, that's maybe possible because different perceptions, the depth perception. So essentially, there was something there that is corroborated. But that's essentially the first night. But what people don't talk about is when they're walking back later on after the incident, another
But
object
before you go into that, though, I want to get the detail of what Jim Pennison says he saw close up. So this is where an allegedly triangular-shaped craft, about 2 meters high, 3 by 3 meters in dimensions, that's either landed on the ground or hovering just above the ground.
Yep, and he said it was. He says it was like a opaque glass, black glass. He said it was warm to the touch. It felt like glass. And he said at one point there were etchings, and at one point he found some symbols that he wrote down in his pocketbook.
Okay, and you find Jim Pennison a credible witness, don't you?
I do to that first incident. Where I have red flags as a former detective is when 30 years later he told the audience at a community centre 30th anniversary conference that he'd had a download of material. Now, I'm not saying downloads can't happen. I think it's possible that you can. But there were many things that he said that were inconsistent. He basically didn't tell anybody for 30 years. And there's lots of inconsistencies that I go in the book. So for me, he comes out with what's called the binary codes, which were a number of pages he'd written in his book, which were then later analysed and suggested places like Giza, coordinates, that it was time travellers from the future, I think 8,100 years in the future, coming back to Earth. It's a standalone story, no corroboration.
And crucially, at the time when he gave his statement originally, he never mentioned any of this stuff about a download. He never mentioned what he'd written down in his diary, in his notebook, and there was nothing of this kind of detail. That I agree is a bit of a red flag.
The pocketbook that you now see in all the documentaries didn't surface until about 1997, which is a red flag in itself. You know, he retired, I think, 1993. So why didn't it come out?
One of the things I want you to talk about is John Burroughs, because John Burroughs is a really interesting case because he suffered some kind of physical injury as a result of alleged exposure. Talk me through that, because I know I spoke once to Senator John McCain when he was on the campaign trail, and I actually asked him about the John Burroughs case, and he mentioned it and talked about how he'd assisted Burroughs to procure his medical records because the Defence Department was resisting release of them.
Yeah, John Burroughs is an interesting figure, but he's not the only one. There are at least 5 who sustained injuries, which we can talk about in a bit. But with regards to John Burroughs, he was obviously in close proximity. But what a lot of people don't realise is that John had multiple encounters over that Christmas period. He was involved with an incident with Sergeant Adrian Bustinza, the person who I say is a great linking character. And essentially, when Holt's team had gone out, they were out for about 4.5 hours, traipsing around, following lights, and they saw multiple objects.
And that was the night after the Penistone Burrows
Yeah,
incident.
this was 2 nights later.
2 nights later.
Two
Okay,
nights
right.
later. Okay. And so Holt leads a team out. Cutting a long story short, they see multiple UFOs in the sky, some of them shining beams down in the direction of the nuclear weapons storage area at Bentwaters. But eventually, after 4.5 hours, they come back to what's called the staging area. Now, the staging area is an interesting, and it's a key place because it's where the vehicles couldn't go any further into the forest. So you had a collection of maybe 8 or 9 vehicles and maybe 20 or 30 US Air Force security police basically just waiting for orders, milling around, because Holt had said, I want everybody staying back. I'm going out with my team. Now, John Burroughs wasn't a part of that team. At the time, he was off duty. He lived in Ipswich, 7-8 miles away, and he managed to get a lift in. He had a sense that something was going on. Well, cutting a long story short, as we say in England, when Holt came back with his team, of which Sergeant Adrian Bustinza was one of them, so which is interesting. So Bustinza's just come back, Holt just comes back. John Burroughs says, can I go out in the forest? And so Holt, for whatever reason, says, yeah, okay, go for a short time if you need to go out there. And he asked Sergeant Adrian Bustinza to go with him. Now, he's just come in after 4.5 hours of tramping around, but he agreed to go. Now, as they're walking, the two of them, away from everybody else, and the exact position of where this occurs is not identified, but it's close to the farmer's field, a very strange thing happens. Adrian Bustinza, and this is from his perspective, he will say that he felt like he was pushed from behind, and he fell forward onto his knees. And as he did so, putting his hands down on the ground, an incredible bright white light engulfed John Burroughs, who was maybe 20, 30 feet in front of him on this pathway. And when he looked forward, he saw that John, who was like 6'6", huge guy, on the left of him, within this light, was a small life form figure. And on the other side, there was another small 4 feet, 5 feet figure with Big John in the middle, engulfed in this incredible light. Now, here's an interesting thing, that when that light was cast on John, part of it cast on Adrian Bustinza, on his groin area and his fingers, and he's had rashes there ever since. So that's a knock-on effect. So when John maybe had a really close encounter, it was then, because that affected his heart muscles, and he later on was very ill, nearly died, and he eventually got help, and he was saved through medical operations. But his files
crucially, the thing that I've always been fascinated by is, am I wrong in saying what Senator McCain told me, which is that John Burroughs' illness was attributed to his service?
Well, if John McCain said that to you as a direct comment from him, then I would take it as read. When John eventually got help through John McCain, had got paid out and he got treated, whatever, John released a press release that basically said this is totally attributable to Rendlesham Forest by encounter. Now, I immediately emailed him and said, look, I don't want to know the figures that you got from the VA, anything like that, but can I see that document? Because I want to see it in writing, as it were. And he didn't release it. And so what I'm saying is there is actually no corroboration that is tied to it, although everybody thinks that it is.
The thing about this whole incident, and you and I have had this experience even talking about it, even my limited understanding of the case is clearly not consistent with what you've been told in your more recent research with witnesses. It's clear, as you say, there were a lot more events than we've been ever told about the Rendlesham Forest case. It wasn't just one event in particular that the News of the World story focused on in 1983.
Yeah.
It was actually multiple events. And as you say, there are 17 events.
I mean, let me tell you about some of these new events, new accounts that nobody had ever heard of that are in the book. There was a guy called Airman Steve Wagner, and he'd had an earlier sighting during 1980. And I write in the book that there were 3 important precursor cases. leading up to those late December events that are important because they're all UFO related. And surely, if we're talking about UFOs and why they're interested in the twin bases, that they're a part of the story. And he'd had a sighting of his own in, I think, was November, just a month before. Now, when he reported it officially, seeing a small glowing red ball about the size of a beach ball near the flight line, near to the weapons storage area, so it was near aircraft, and it was on RAF Bentwaters, not in the forest, on Bentwaters, near to the weapons storage area. When he reported that officially, he was given a hard time. We don't want to know about this, blah, blah, blah. You keep quiet about this. By his bosses.
So you're in no doubt there was a cover-up. And do you think it was a lot to do with the fact that whatever these objects were, they were clearly taking an interest in the weapons storage area where thermonuclear B-61 nuclear bombs were stored?
Yes, and there's a couple of things that back that up. Not only did a lot of the airmen, very reluctantly, I might add, because they were very loyal to their oath that they'd taken and they didn't want to get into any trouble, but eventually they'd said, yeah, we're guarding tactical nuclear weapons, including Sergeant Adrian Bustinter, including another guy called Airman Steve Longero, including Steve Wagner, who we just talked about now. Essentially, Holt told me on 2 occasions, the first night I ever met him in December 2007 for filming for the UFO Hunters TV series for the History Channel. We were in the pub together. We'd arrived more or less at the same time. He didn't know me, but I knew him. And so for me, it was a big thrill. I'd been invited on because of my previous RAF experience. And I said to him, have you still got secrets? And he basically said, well, I've got a few things if ever I need to use them. He never really told me what they were. But in the process of that conversation, he said there were more nuclear weapons at RAF Bentwaters underground than anywhere else in Britain. And then later on, when we're doing that walk around the forest in 2010, as was attested to and witnessed by my second wife, Lynn, she heard him say there were more nuclear weapons at RAF Bentwaters than anywhere else in Europe. Now, it was a nuclear base, and in the book I find a document that proves that Bentwaters had nuclear weapons. But it's the amount, and I think that is the key to the story. They turn up because there's a nuclear weapons inspection, I think, of sorts.
Now, Gary, I'm going to surprise you with this question because you're not expecting it, and this might be something that takes you down a path you've never gone down before. In the course of my research into psionic operations secretly conducted by the US Air Force, it has been suggested to me that there was an extra presence at the base in this period, that a large aircraft was deployed. I think it was a big
C5 Galaxy.
C5 Galaxy, and that there was a team located at a far end of the base doing operations that people weren't aware of. It has been suggested to me that RAF Bentwaters might have been being used for experimental psionic operations, and that what brought the craft down might have been one of these people who are psionic attempting to engage with the craft and disrupt it to bring it down so that they could recover it. Maybe Rendlesham was a secret attempt at a craft retrieval. What do you say to that?
That's not beyond the realms of possibility, but the evidence for that is slim at the moment. What I can say is that a number of witnesses, military witnesses I spoke to, confirmed that a C5 Galaxy landed, that it parked up at the end of RAF Woodbridge at the runway, closest to the forest where a lot of the events occurred, and that a special team wearing no insignia of any kind, and even Holt has mentioned this and confirmed this on a couple of occasions, that they went out into the forest and did something. And that basically they were told, everybody else was told, leave them alone, they can do whatever they want.
And this is before the incidents took place that were recorded of the UAPs, or afterwards?
As far as I'm aware, the witnesses that I've spoken to, and at least 3 have told me this, it was after the incidents. Now, just to bring this into perspective, the more you dig, the more you're likely to find. And it's still an evolving story. And I still think there are many more witnesses there. ready to come out. But a lot of them have been put off by all the infighting, the arguing amongst the different witnesses. Different agendas seem to be at place. And I think it's a shame because it's a brilliant case.
Yeah, so you've never heard any suggestion that there were psionics, people with psychic abilities, brought to the base to endeavour to try to connect with these objects?
No, but I can tell you an interesting story, and it's an anecdote, but it may well tie into this. During many years ago, perhaps 2011, 2012, I got an email from somebody who purported to be a colonel and who'd been there during the events. And he said he was a radar specialist. And he said that they were trying all this different stuff to try to engage, right? I'd never gone public with this until now, in the sense of this. And I had a long series of emails. And it sounded really, really plausible that they were messing with high-frequency radars. And we know that it was a radar hotspot for many, many years, and that something had happened that had brought something in. Now, that sounds very much a bit like a psionic kind of element. However, where it got interesting and kind of faded for me is after maybe having 10 email interactions, and I've still got them, eventually I said, okay, it's very interesting what you're saying, but I need you now to prove to me who you are and what you are. You need to show me your credentials, and I'll keep them confidential, but you need to prove to me you are the real deal. And at that, it never came back to me. So for me, I could never brief it publicly. I won't go out with the story as such, but that's what his story was. And it sounded very compelling. But when I asked for the corroboration, he wouldn't give me any.
So let's just accept, for the benefit of the rest of this conversation, that we agree that something anomalous happened in Rendlesham Forest that was reported and seen by multiple witnesses.
Yeah.
And that included, as you say, on the base, we saw craft shooting beams of light down near or on the weapons storage area.
I've got a direct witness who was inside the weapons storage area. Airman Steve Longero. He said, I'm inside, and the beam comes down, and it does like a grid-like pattern search of the entire hot row, approximately 300 meters long.
One other thing you talk about is radar. It was the case that these objects were detected on radar. True?
Initially, at the time, they would go on to, when the incidents were happening, Holt would say that they tried to get Eastern radar. Brief blip near the forest. There was one later information that came out in the late 90s that said an object had been seen near Rendlesham at 37,000 feet, then dipped off the radar. But what was later interesting is, and I'm sure you know of him, Robert Hastings in UFOs and Nukes, fantastic book, arguably one of the top 5 books ever written on the subject.
Brilliant book, yeah.
Absolutely. And he found 2 American radar operatives who went public in 2004 in his book, and then in his documentary in 2008. And they basically said they'd been in the air traffic control tower when one of the objects had actually been next to the tower. So, yeah, clearly there is radar, but a lot of the time, especially in UK cases, when things are seen on radar, people turn up the next day, a bit like the Nimitz and the Tic-Tac. Somebody goes on and says, give us your tapes, never to be seen again. Well, that happened at RAF 1.
What we do know is that there is a consistent pattern of accounts from multiple witnesses that there were interrogations and some attempt at a cover-up. Talk me through that.
Right. We talked about injuries, we can go on to that, but in terms of interrogations, the people that have confirmed that they had severe interrogations, and actually Holt has gone on the record to say they were interviewed very aggressively by unknown bodies, as it were, and given a very hard time, which is wrong. But essentially, Sergeant Jim Peniston, so he's the first night landing, the small triangular craft. So it makes sense that he gets a hard time. And they kept saying to him, they gave him sodium pentothal and the truth serum, and they said, keep drawing it, draw it for me, draw it.
So they gave him, you're very clear that he was given sodium pentothal. Yeah. How did he know that he was given sodium pentothal? Why would he even know that?
He was told that. He was told that when he was being aggressively interrogated. That's all you can say, by multiple groups. This wasn't just one interrogation. He had multiple re-interviews, and some of these were really aggressive. And he said that at one point he was told that could they give him sodium pentothal because they wanted to get to the truth. And they kept saying to him, draw it, and that's the craft in his pocket. Draw it. So that's one. You then get now. Interestingly, John Burroughs he gets interviewed, but he's not given a hard time. He's never really talked about interrogation. But the driver, who was also part of that 3-man team originally, Kabanzik, he was given a hard time. He was told to sign a statement that he hadn't written. It's the lighthouse. It's the lighthouse. It's not a lighthouse. So that happened. Sergeant Adrian Bustinza, who corroborates Warren's account of the second landing, he said he was threatened with death if he spoke out. Bullets are cheap. Now, Larry Warren had also said that he'd been interrogated, taken to an underground facility under the base photo lab, which everybody denies, but both Bustinza and Larry Warren say that they went underground to a facility under the base photo lab and that they were given a hard time. When you read my book and the interview that I did with Adrian Bustinza, he was almost in tears when he was telling me this, because he was reliving this nightmare. And he said, I was disgusted. There I am, a sergeant in the US Air Force. I've just got caught up in something, and they're now telling me that if I don't do what they want, they're going to kill me. And he said, I felt like running away and going AWOL, absent without leave, deserted. That's how bad he felt. And when you read that part of the transcript, it's almost palpable of the pressure that he was put under. And later on, his family was surveilled for a long time. Now, in the interim...
Just slow down a bit. I mean, with Bustinza, he tried to call his mum, didn't he? And then the phone call was cut off. Is that Bustinza who made that?
No, that's Larry Warren.
That's Larry Warren.
That's Larry Warren. And I spoke to a lady who was present at the receipt of that call. Her best friend was Larry Warren's mum, and she was in the room when that call came in. And she said, no, absolutely happened it was cut off.
So Larry's basically telling his mum what happened in the incident, and then all of a sudden the call gets cut.
Yeah, and then he realizes that he's in, for want of a better word, because he's releasing details of something that they're obviously trying to contain.
So his call was being monitored clearly by somebody.
Yeah. He ended up paying a $300 fine for that discrepancy of using the line.
So can I ask you this, because Larry Warren, I think, has copped more criticism than most.
Absolutely.
He's been called a liar, a fabricator, a fraud. People have claimed he wasn't where he said he was. I'm quite shocked to actually read in your book, Non-Human, that you actually give quite a bit of credibility to Larry Warren. What do you say about Larry Warren's evidence?
The reality is there corroboration, and there is. Not just in Sergeant Adrian Bustinza. When I did the research, and if you realise in one of the chapters of the book, Larry Warren wasn't the first one to talk about aliens. There was somebody else within days of the incident who was a sergeant in the US Air Force Police who'd spoken to a friend of his who turns out to be one of the early British civilian investigators, a woman called Dot Butler. And he knew her from on the base through social events, and he told her about aliens had been seen in a craft in the forest. That's where that eventual first story came. So it wasn't Warren making it up. And there were 14 or 15 other part corroborations of the story.
Do you think it's possible that either the US Air Force or whoever it was that was doing these interrogations, or perhaps if these were non-human entities, the non-human entities did something to meddle with people's perception, people's accounts? Because one of the things about the case, I accept that there are always going to be inconsistencies in witness statements. I mean, you'd know that as a copper. I know that as a journalist. People often get their facts wrong. They get times wrong, dates wrong, series of events wrong. But it does seem weird to me in the case that there's so much contradictory evidence about what happened when. And I think your explanation of the fact that there were actually 17 separate incidents is actually quite compelling. It also raises a question in my mind whether something or someone was meddling with the minds of these people. We do know that the phenomenon, slide 9, people talk about how it can manipulate human perception. Do you think something's been getting into these people's heads?
I think it's entirely possible. In terms of, after effects after the incident, there's none really mentioned. But if you think that a lot of them suffered, well, let's put it this way. If you were going to interrogate people because they'd seen something they really shouldn't have done, you'd go for the principal witnesses. So let's think about this. Penniston, principal witness, he gets a really hard time. John Burroughs less so. Ed Cabanzak, he was there. He saw lights through the forest, gets a really hard time. Larry Warren, he gets a really lot of hard time. Adrian Bustinza, who corroborates this second landing. Now, doesn't that tell you something? That the key people that eventually saw the two landings, in effect the two landings, they're the ones getting the hard time. And in terms of injuries, Bustinza had the injuries through the light. Larry Warren had, about 4 years later, developed bleeding from the neck. And when he was examined, they said, have you been anywhere near radiation? John Burroughs got and here's another one. Jim Penniston got injuries, although never really been specified, but he said he got injuries and he got paid out by the VA. But here's the absolute secret one. When I spoke to the Canadian researcher Grant Cameron, he'd heard that the CIA, or a guy called Kit Green, Dr. Kit Green, you may have heard of him, he'd been doing a test of people who'd been in close proximity, and I brought him over for a conference. I used to do conferences, and I brought him over and I knew Grant pretty well. And anyway, I sat him down and I said, I understand that some of the Rendlesham witnesses have been interviewed as part of this program, Close Proximity, with injuries. And he said, yeah, I think there were 3 Rendlesham witnesses. I said, oh, 3. I said, who's that then? And he went, Jim Penniston, John Burroughs, i.e. from the first night. And guess who was the third one who was never supposed to be there? Colonel Gordon Williams, the base commander.
Oh, really?
Yes.
That's interesting. Because it's interesting. One of the details in your book that leapt out at me was, I think it was Bustinza said he saw Colonel Gordon Williams, the base commander,
in a silent face-off,
escorting a film or a video that had been shot of the craft to an aircraft.
That's a captain who does that. He basically picks him up after the incident, and he's Colonel Williams is got a top secret satchel or bag, some kind of hold-all that's top secret, and he says, Colonel, what's in the bag? And he said, it's film of the UFO. This is directly after the incident, this second landing, this controversial, it never happened, but it really did, and it was filmed incident. And he said he told him it was the moving picture video, motion picture, so film, not still pictures. And he said he drove him up to an F-18, I think F-16, and he said the pilot, he went up the little ladder, handed it to the pilot, canopy came down, plane took off, and apparently the film, he says, where's it going to? And he says, it's going to Ramstein, which is the head of the 8th Air Force in Europe. So that would make sense. But here's another interesting thing that comes out in the book. Later on, we know it got to the Pentagon because an American researcher called Ray Boucher did some great work for 3 years on Rendlesham for MUFON. And he probably did the best bit of research in the 80s. And he said at one point he got familiar because he kept putting in FOI requests to the lady who ran the FOI desk at the Pentagon. And he did it so much that they kind of became friends, first name basis. And eventually she told him that this is interesting. I've just heard some pilots, American pilots, talking about the Rendlesham film. And she said, I've looked, there's nothing in our records about a Rendlesham film. So she actually corroborated that the film probably at some point got to the Pentagon, where it still may be in the, the Raiders of the Lost Ark big archive.
Well, certainly somebody didn't want the full Rendlesham story being told.
Absolutely.
I still wrestle with why, if it's true that Lieutenant Colonel Charles Holt knew more than he's letting on, I still wrestle with why he came public with the memo that he did come up with? Why didn't the US Air Force just tell him and everybody else to shut up about it? Why did they volunteer to the Defense Department?
Ross, you must understand that they did. The US Air Force was bombarded with inquiries after the Holt Memorandum came out. Tell us about this. But prior to that, they'd been bombarded by little snippets in the press. Tell us nothing's happened. Eventually the memo comes out, and then they have to admit that 2 incidents took place because it's in the memo.
So you think the Holt memo might have been an attempt by the US to try to play down to allay public concern?
And and I mentioned it in the book. There's a very famous clip that James Fox got with Colonel Gordon Williams, who retired as a 2-star general, I might add. And he'd been playing golf, I think, and he's leaning against his car at the end of a round. And James Fox interviews him, and basically he comes out with something that later came back as a recurring theme. He said, once the memo came out, it lived a life of its own because we couldn't put Humpty Dumpty back together again. But what it said was we had to admit it when the memo came out because it was on noted US Air Force paper. We couldn't deny it. Holt had tried to get that pulled. He knew that his life would never be the same. He was told it will never come out, that memo. So when Williams said that, he basically was saying that, yes, we've got to admit the 2 incidents that's in the memo, but we're not going to admit to anything else.
But crucially, you're the copper, you're the detective, you've spoken to all the witnesses.
Yep.
Do you think Charles Holt saw a craft that night? Yes. And did he also see entities? Do you think he saw aliens?
I suspect yes, because Warren and Bustinza will both say that that he's there, as was Colonel Williams in that second film.
So there's multiple corroborative witnesses. What did the commander, Gordon Williams, say? Did he deny any knowledge of a craft?
He denied ever being in the field. He denied ever responding to it. He was in his office just listening to little updates on the radio. He's the base commander of 12,000 personnel. Do you think he'd not be informed or not really be there? It's ludicrous. But that was the big secret. That was the story.
So somewhere in the dark recesses of the Pentagon, as you say, Raiders of the Lost Ark archive, there may very well be film or video of what we're talking about.
Yes, I absolutely believe that film did exist and that the cameras were there. I mean, Bustinza corroborated there were cameras there and it was motion picture. There are so many things. What you've got to understand, going back to your Larry Warren point, was that the first person that came out and put his name to it and said, this is what I saw, I don't know what anybody else saw, but this is what I saw, was Larry Warren in late 1982. He was on his own. Yeah.
And that's before the Holt memo came out.
Yeah. He was telling that in late December 1982. And basically what emerged was that he was the only one in the public eye doing media interviews for about 8 years. And the only time his credibility was attacked was as soon as Holt retired in 91, when Burroughs retired in, I think, 95, and then Pennison in 93. Then they all said, nah, this is
which does put a whole new perspective and complexion on Holt's coming out publicly and speaking, because the implications are that, God forbid, Colonel Charles Holt might have been part of the cover-up, not part of the attempt at disclosure.
I believe that's likely to be the case. He got into Holt, and I knew him well. He did not ever get interrogated, questioned about his involvement, which is a bit odd.
Did you ever hear any reference by Charles Holt to STS-24, a particular US Air Force unit?
No.
I'm told he may have been a member of a very elite US Air Force unit. I do think Colonel Charles Holt, has a very interesting story to tell, and he knows a lot more.
Well, can I just, there's one little story. I know that time will be going on, but this is really pertinent. When I looked at some of the old research, I came across a document by that same MUFON researcher called Ray Boucher, who actually was the first person ever to ring up Holt. He was still in the Air Force 6 years before he retired. He rings him up and he says, I am Ray Boucher, I work for MUFON, I'm researching this incident and the memorandum, blah, blah, blah. And he was nice as pie with him, was Holt. And then he said, I'm doing some research for Senator Exxon, who was on the Armed Services Committee. And Ray Boucher lived in Nebraska. So he said, you should be interested in this because this is American airmen. You should be interested in this case. And he said, well, if you bring me more evidence, I'll look into it. Well, he rings up Holt out of the blue. Holt's 6 years before he retires, and he explains all this to him. And he says, well, Larry Warren, a witness, has said that you were there, that this happened, the second landing in the farmer's field, and it was being filmed, and there was security police personnel around it. And Holt said, and he wrote it down verbatim, he said, yeah, I can verify all of that. I can substantiate all of that for the senator.
So he thought he was talking to somebody working for the senator.
No, he knew he was talking to a UFO researcher, but at that time, before he was this public figure, he just admitted in a perfect admission that the incident in the field had happened, a second landing, that it was surrounded by security police, that entities had been seen, and that it was being filmed. And he just said, yeah, I can verify all of that.
Which all underlines how the Rendlesham incident is probably the most recent UAP sighting of all time. So, Gary, before we go, how can people get hold of copies of your book, Non-Human?
It's only available on Amazon. I self-published it, not because I didn't go to a mainstream publisher, because I knew that I wanted to get the story out, and I didn't want to be blocked by anybody. There's so many agendas at play in this story. I thought I want to get the facts out. And as soon as it went out, so it's only available on Amazon in whichever country, and you'll find it. $17.99, 500 pages.
Well, the one thing we can be sure of in all of the mystery of the Rendlesham Forest, RAF Bentwaters, RAF Woodbridge incident is that, 1980, that's 45 years on, the cover-up continues.
Absolutely.
Gary Heseltine, thank you so much for talking to Reality Check.
Thank you.
And before we go, please don't forget to send in any questions you have for me to realitycheck@newsnationnow.com. Looking forward to answering your questions as best as we can.